Hello, everyone, and welcome to Oncology Trial Recruitment, Challenging Indications and Challenging Studies, presented by Medpace. I'm Michael Gibney, Production Editor for Fierce Life Sciences, and I will be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Lion Gleish, MD, Vice President of Medical Affairs, Oncology at Medpace, Jennifer L. Cutter, PhD, and Ross Izadi, BS, MBA, Directors, Clinical Trial Management, Oncology at Medpace. You can read their full bios on the left side of your window. Just a few technical notes before we begin. If you'd like to download the slide deck, please click the Files button at the lower left of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. We will follow the presentations by a Q&A session. Please submit your questions during or after the presentations, clicking the Q&A button in the lower left corner of the screen. All right, now let's begin. Lion, please go ahead.
Thanks very much. This is Dr. Lion Gleish speaking, and let me also reintroduce my colleagues sitting with me are Jennifer Cutter and Ross Izadi. And let's get right into this. So we put this talk together because this is something we get asked very frequently by our sponsors about what do we do on our oncology studies to meet their recruitment goals. If the sponsor has preset clear-cut goals, what are we going to do to meet those? If we're helping them develop the program and develop appropriate recruitment goals, how do we go about that? And what are important considerations to take into account? And especially when you couple that with the way the field's changing, what can you do to design your studies so that you can better hit your recruitment goals? So with that as an introductory comment, we do want to point out just how much the field is currently changing, and this adds a lot of challenges to recruitment on oncology studies. Immuno-oncology has blossomed, so if you were going to set out to do an immuno-oncology study 5 years ago, you would have gotten a lot of investigators scoffing at the idea, well, immuno-oncology doesn't really work. Now you have this boom that almost everyone wants to do immuno-oncology, and the patients are very interested in it. So maybe there's a little less interest in some of the other areas, not to say immuno-oncology is a cure-all, it's not, but it's a nice step forward. But the other thing you end up with then is a lot of immuno-oncology studies that might prohibit patients coming on if they've had prior immunotherapy of some type. And if the immuno-oncology has made it into multiple approved drugs and multiple indications, that's then throwing another challenge into it. And we, of course, still have studies in targeted agents and with antibodies, and there's lots of new development in antibody-drug conjugates. And then there's the other area that we find is quite challenging, which are the biosimilars. And you can split those really into true biosimilars, where a sponsor might be developing a copy, so to speak, of an existing antibody, or a drug that's a bio-better, where in making their drug that's somewhat similar, there's something about the drug that actually has a safety advantage or a therapeutic advantage compared to the existing drug. The bio-better study could arguably be slightly easier to recruit because the patients are offered an advantage. On the biosimilar study, the main benefit to the patient is usually an economic advantage. So it has a completely different set of considerations to take into account than a true new molecular entity that might be offering a tremendous new efficacy benefit for the subject. There are lots of things that sponsors take into account when they're developing their trials and their development plans. They might be trying to target fast-track designation or to be able to be approved under Subpart H and have accelerated approval, and therefore going for a very, very narrow indication that's highly pre-specified to clearly meet an unmet medical need to fill a regulatory niche. And in going for such a niche, there's then obviously a niche population that fills it. It's very limited. So even if you were reaching out to a very large site, that large site might still have a smaller population available. This can present additional challenges. If you're a site, typically your preference is going to be a study that if you go through all the efforts to get your study started and opened at your site, that you could put a lot of patients on. But a lot of these studies that are going for accelerated approval and are in narrow indications, even the largest sites can at best put 2 or 3 patients on a year. That can cause some of the sites to have resource issues and to choose not to participate in some of these studies because they just don't see it being worth their efforts. So these are important issues to keep in mind when you're designing the program and asking yourself, are you making the indication too narrow compared to what you could still do and still qualify for some of these benefits like accelerated approval? We see more and more studies using basket trials. The agency's been accepting of this approach, especially trials that might be going after a specific type of genetic indication and then having baskets of different tumor types. There are lots of other varieties of basket trials, and I'm not going to get into all of that, but know that they have a different management issue. For example, if you're opening a large cancer center that might be subdivided by therapeutic areas, so you would tend to have a different set of PIs for the gynecologic studies and a different PI for lung cancer and a different PI for GI cancers. If you open a basket trial there and the GI specialist is your PI, he might not do well at filling some of those other baskets. Whereas at a smaller center, it might be different. At a community center where the medical oncologist might see all those groups, that individual PI might be able to do it themselves. At the larger center, they might have to go through a complex partnering process that is not part of how their institution is typically set up, and that could be adding additional challenges to it. We continue to see a lot of genetically targeted studies. Now, this could be true for targeted agents. It can also be true if you're looking at the immuno-oncology drugs even, where some of them are looking at specific targets, be it an immunohistochemistry finding of PD-1 expression or some other type of finding that's predictive of response to that immunotherapy. Again, introduces a whole other set of challenges to overcome for recruitment. If patients have to have fresh tumor collected for a study, and the tumor has to be sent to a central lab for analysis, that's extra time that the patient might need to wait to go on that trial when they'd be able to right away go on a different study. So while the specificity of the genetics might look very exciting and wow, if the patient has this genetic marker, they have a high chance of responding to the drug. But believe it or not, patients might not like the 1, 2, or 3 week waiting period to find out if they're eligible during a period where they're not getting treated. And then clearly there are issues on protocol, country, and site selection that we'll get into in more detail and take many of these different competing factors into account. So we think one of the key issues to performing any trial, particularly with respect to recruitment, is having the best possible protocol for the goals of the trial. And the earlier slide discussed your goals and the regulatory considerations, and this slide really talks about putting together the protocol from a recruitment point of view. So really, when you're thinking about the protocol, the regulatory considerations are always going to some degree have to trump your protocol design. You have to be looking at what your indication is. The earlier in your program's development, you can have in mind what your label will look like and what will be your indication, will help you even design the earlier stage protocols better and have a better sense of the exact target population you're always going to be going after, and let you consider ways that you can keep that population as broad as possible to help facilitate recruitment throughout the program. Additionally, there can be a lot of important considerations to take into account early, like if your trial is going to need a companion diagnostic, to get the work on the companion diagnostic program moving forward early so that you don't have to later repeat early steps. I cannot stress enough how important the phase 1 design to the trials are. Currently, many of the oncology products do get approved off of a phase 2 or a combined phase 2, phase 3 type study and not a traditional large, massive, randomized, double-blind phase 3 trial. So you're not necessarily going through multiple studies to get your drug approved, and the phase 1 study will be what you're going to hang your hat on in terms of your dosing regimen and the dose. And if there are errors in the population of the phase 1 study or in the handling or design of the study, that's then going to be a problem all the way through the rest of the program. There are a lot of options for how to optimize the phase 1 design. Adaptive designs can help limit low-dose exposure of subjects. Being sure that you have the correct MTD with the correct regimen is important. So you might define the MTD and be able to then jump into phase 2, which can often be very tempting. But it could turn out that at that MTD, you're seeing a number of grade 2 events that weren't quite DLTs, and maybe if you do extra cohorts to change the regimen slightly, you can make the drug better tolerated, which would therefore obviously help with further recruitment of further trials. And yes, that might add a few months onto the phase 1 development program, but it might cut multiple months off the later parts of your development program and lead to a better overall label. Most commonly, we see phase 1-2 studies in the early design, where we'll do specific expansion groups as well, which can be very, very helpful in planning how to go forward in the registrational studies. And you can also look at what the recruitment rates really are in those expansion groups, and that also gives you a very good idea for how to plan the recruitment rates and site expectations for when you're in the later, larger, more important studies. With respect to later phase trials, the phase 2-3 registrational trials, it's going to depend a lot on the specificity of the indication for whether you're dealing with a true randomized study and whether on top of that you have placebo, which is an additional hurdle, or you have a single-arm study. Obviously, even if you're in a specific indication, a single-arm study has a lot of advantages. The oncology patient loves to be getting the new drug that they perceive as being better, even if it's not proven to be better. And it does take a lot of work at the site level to talk the patient into going on the placebo-controlled trials, but obviously they're possible to do. Planning ahead can lead to a trial in a very specific population that can have recruitment challenges, but if you plan ways to try to broaden that population, to show that there's efficacy in that population, you can then make that trial able to meet its recruitment goals. If a randomized design is required, one of the errors we sometimes see sponsors make is to try to jump into that randomized, very large study, maybe a few hundred patients, too early, with trying to skip over a significantly sized phase 2 program to be sufficiently sure of their response rate, and that the response rate that they might have achieved in a phase 1 expansion group with a small number of select sites can be achieved at a broader number of sites, or even better yet, in a broader number of geographic locations. Start including other countries to be sure that when you're in your phase 3 trial, you really meet the efficacy parameters you saw in the early phase studies. So we would advocate in general that the trial design should aim to broaden the study population as much as possible to still meet the regulatory requirements that you're aiming for. And always try to get the regulatory requirements that are going to be much harder to do in late phase, like a formalized PK analysis or ECG trials done as early as possible so that you're not having to deal with those in the later phases of the study. I'm going to turn things over at this time to Ross.
Thank you, Lion. I'm just going to go through a few slides regarding country and site selection. Some of it Lion covered, so I'm going to discuss it in more details. As Lion mentioned, it starts from this study design, inclusion, exclusion criteria within the protocol. Assuming it's a common oncology trial and it's available in every country, every region equally, the first thing we really want to do is basically make sure we are aligned with the sponsors, regulatory goals and regulatory pathway they see for the compound for getting it approved. Is their goal for already approved compound and is a label change? Is it that if they're going to go specifically for a specific indication that wasn't approved previously and they want to, it's a niche area they want to get into, and even a specific country that they want to get approval. So that's very important from the operational side that we know and we can align ourselves for country selection and region selection overall. There are competitive advantages within the environment right now in different countries that we can go into. Obviously, U.S. is very competitive. A lot of trials are done in the U.S. and North America. So there are other regions we need to consider depending on the size and the phase of the study and the patient population. Obviously, if there's any geographical hotspot, we want to maximize that and open those sites and countries as much as possible. Lion also touched upon on genetic testing requirements. As you all know, we are getting more and more of that. It's really important once we are global and we are getting into the country selection, we ensure what type of genetic testing the sites are doing as a standard of care. Are they doing IHC? Are they doing FISH? Is it required for them to do NGS, next generation sequencing? That is becoming more and more prevalent, that we need to make sure these countries are doing this specific testing as required for the study. And also there are countries globally that might have some specific requirements for getting tissue and blood samples and genetic samples out of the countries, which comes into our consideration. Not all the time, but again, there are some countries that we are very strict about that. There are trials if there are required previous treatments. For example, if it's a third line and they specify exactly what the patient should have received. There are agencies that actually even may insist on saying exactly what dose the patient should have received. We recommend not including that in a protocol, but if it's included, that becomes part of our feasibility and consideration when we contacted our country managers and associates and our KOLs within those countries to make sure that is standard of care for those countries. If they require a doublet or previous gemcitabine at a specific dose, those are things that we definitely want to make sure that is that standard of care for those patients within those regions. Okay. Within U.S., we have a mix of large academic centers and community centers in most of our studies. Again, depending on the phase and the patient population, we might have a different proportions of large academic centers. For example, again, if it's a third or fourth line trial and the patient population is becoming lower and lower, basically, so we would have a more bigger academic centers who would participate in the study because of that requirement. Within Western Europe, you find that we have very good sites, which academic centers that have similar enrollment to U.S. So we would include them within our sites and within our studies. They have very excellent enrollment and quality of care and hospitals there. Eastern Europe, they have a high potential for enrollment, so we would take that into our consideration. If we are selecting European countries and sites, obviously we would select sites and countries we have worked with before. We have good experience with. They've been good performing centers, and we also put some measures in place to have more monitoring of the sites as in the background and on-site monitoring of their data. Asia Pacific are the developed countries within Asia Pacific, like South Korea. They are very similar to Western Europe and U.S. Their standard of care and their enrollment. In developing countries, it's attractive for enrollment and maybe less competitive in there. So we just have to make sure that they have the facility and capable of seeing these patients and their standard of care matches what the design of the study is. China obviously has a large potential because of their population, but one has to consider their startup timeline for including them in the study. And Latin America, very similar. There are countries that have larger startup timelines, so we would take that into consideration before including them in the study.
And this is Lion. What I want to add to what Ross said is when we do a feasibility, the medical group here at Medpace and the operational group really work closely together, and we think that's important at the sponsor level as well. When you're developing a protocol, when you're developing the planning, especially in oncology, this interplay of medical and operational really leads to greater success. It would be very difficult for the operational group to be aware of what the standard of care is in the developing world in Asia. And if you're doing a typical oncology study that might have required failure of such and such a treatment for that disease, to know if that type of treatment is just a U.S. standard or if it's the standard everywhere else is a very important consideration to take into account in planning the study out, because you can imagine if you planned that study out originally thinking you can go internationally, but it turned out no, because a part of that treatment's expensive or difficult to give. It's only given in the U.S. and select places in Western Europe. And for that indication, the regulators would want the patients to have gotten that specific drug for the FDA to consider the trial later on. You have to be taking those issues into account. So in some ways, it's easier to include developed countries when you're looking at a first-line study, but when you're looking at second, third-line studies, which is quite common, these considerations become very, very important. And let me turn things over to Jennifer.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Lion and Ross. I want to spend the last little bit of time talking about site engagement and also patient engagement. We all know that if we don't have the correct sites selected, they are our biggest recruitment tool, so we have to select the correct sites for the studies. Only a small minority of oncology patients that would qualify for a study actually participate in studies. So again, our biggest recruitment tool is selecting the right sites, the right PIs, the one that have those patients. So the earlier you can involve sites and PIs in your trial design and the protocol development, the easier it is going to be to get those patients into the study. So here at Medpace, we really like to form our site partnerships. And so by forming our partnerships, we'll work with them through multiple studies, sometimes even through the entire development of a compound. One of the things that we do here is that when a site asks a question, we act with urgency to get that response back. That keeps them highly engaged. They know that we are working with them as a team, and that if they have a question from their IRB or need an informed consent returned around quickly, we'll get that back to them. We also work a lot with sites to engage their referral networks. If they need any help in conducting any information sessions, such as tumor boards or grand rounds, we can help put together slides for that. And then we also really encourage them to work with all of their entire physician network. So any of their referring physicians. These sites aren't all going to be large academic centers. Some might strictly be a referral center. So again, having those contacts with the community centers, moving them directly into a site that is solely concentrated on working on clinical studies is very helpful. And then also, as Lion had alluded to as well, even though you have a study open at an institution, not all physicians that can put a patient into that study might be aware of it. So again, helping sites work with their colleagues within their institutions. Another big recruitment tool we have is just the study drug itself. So the protocol, if it's designed well and if the study drug is very attractive to both patients and physicians, that is very helpful. So working with the education on the sites, the PIs, on what the mechanism of action of that drug is, and really what the benefits of that drug could be versus another study or another study drug. And then really lastly for the site, I just wanted to highlight that feedback does go always between if there's something that the site can be doing better, if there's something that the sponsor can be doing better, or something that the CRO can be doing better, really a lot of open communication. So for your earlier phase studies, this usually happens with a safety review committee call, which could be a weekly call. If it's a later phase study, those calls might not need to be as frequent. You might be able to have them monthly or quarterly. But again, let those calls be an opportunity, an open forum to provide feedback on what's going well and what's not going well. And just one last thing about the safety review committee meetings. If you are doing a dose escalation, to involve the PIs in those decisions and reviewing the data really helps to keep them engaged. And then overall for general study updates, newsletters go over well as just email blasts. Just an update, here we are at the study, this is when we think study recruitment might end, et cetera. So just make sure you get the information out there. And the most important part of any study are really our patients, and how do we find their patients to get into our studies. There's multiple resources out on the internet. Clinicaltrials.gov is a great resource. However, they don't always have a lot of study details or even site information. So a good way to get out to a lot of potential patients are trial websites that do have links to the study locations, contact information at those sites, frequently asked questions, etc. Although not all studies do it, some studies are branded. They'll have like a single name. That also does help with recruitment at times. It depends, again, on the phase of the study. But all of those study-specific websites are very important to getting patients funneled into your study. A big help is the advocacy groups, and although this really needs to be engaged prior to when the patients come in, but advocacy groups can be an initial point of contact that patients are going to when they're initially diagnosed. I will say that if you are going to be using an advocacy group, make sure you get them involved early, and they can help review the protocol to help determine if there's any kind of limiting factors to recruitment. They might also be able to provide some insights to patient behavior. They'll also help to promote that study within their websites as well. Social media is something that's upon us all, and I would say just use it a little bit with caution. It can work for you very well, but it can also work against you. So it is a way to connect patients with caregivers and also post-study information, but I would say, again, do this with caution because it can backfire on you. Again, with our patients, the biggest thing to help them is to educate them, to help so you can help develop some conversation tools. If there's any, like an iPad app on the consenting process, just so they understand what that whole process is like. There's a lot of educational material out there about clinical studies by multiple groups. Just helping them when they go into their physician ask the right question, is this study right for me? And I guess lastly, really, make sure you have some kind of contingency plan in place. Not every recruitment tool is going to work for every study, so have some additional ones in place. We don't use these a lot for oncology studies, but there's a traditional outreach, TV, radio, and newspapers. But also looking at other folks within the institution that might be able to help, whether it's somebody in a pharmacy, a pathology lab, someplace other than that PI. And also to help these patients if there are limited sites open in limited countries, help to provide some travel support and other kind of options to help ease that burden. Hotel stays, it could be their direct transportation costs, reimbursement for mileage for that patient and the caregiver. And then if you do have patients that are coming from out of state, help having a transfer process either from state to state or even from country to country. Just have all those processes set up front. So I guess my big take-home message here is really just education on the clinical trial process. I mean, we do need more patients to participate, so we can all do a better job about getting education out there on what a clinical trial is and what they can expect. So any education on the disease, the drug, the study procedures, et cetera.
So to sum up some of our things here, and before I do, I just want to point out that you can still submit questions on the left side of your screen using the Q&A button. A lot of what we talked about ends up being early planning. Getting that protocol as good as you can, early involvement of the investigators so that it's not you planning the protocol in a box and then handing it to the investigators. If you have key people involved in reviewing it along the way, we as a CRO that runs a lot of studies will catch a lot of operational issues that can make it run smoother. Key investigators will also catch a lot of medical operational issues that can make your study run better and be much more exciting to the patients in ways as well. It also builds their enthusiasm and makes them be more of a member of the trial team so that they serve as advocates for you, not just with their patients, but across the program as well. In this electronic day and age, having a key PI put something on the web about the study can also be very, very helpful. That early engagement helps to facilitate it and trickles all the way down to the patients through their advocacy, through the advocacy groups, through the sites, through the nursing staff at the sites, So having the CRAs be able to train the site so that there's that excitement about what you're doing is really important. We're going to start getting into some of the questions. So I'm going to just go through some of these. One that was asked was, how do we work to increase diversity and minority recruitment, which is an issue that the FDA does care about. So you have to be careful not to select all your sites to be in classic white suburban locations. Many of the larger cancer centers do service a diverse population, particularly those that are in larger cities, and that can be helpful. But if you all may not be aware, we know that the recruitment of minority groups in particular onto cancer studies where there are certain cancers where they might even have an above average occurrence of that disease still tends to remain below that of the white population in the U.S., typically due to reasons related to access to medical care. If this is going to be a very important issue for that particular trial, selecting sites that are going to be located in more urban areas that might have more access can be important, and I've actually even done studies where this was going to be important, and we made sure to have cancer centers that were intentionally in lower class areas that would typically have a higher minority population. Even with doing that, it is very difficult to get the enrollment of the minority population up to the incidence rate for many cancers because of access to care. Some people think there's also a fear in that population about trials, so education can also be helpful. There's less of an issue with a sex split in terms of fewer women than men or vice versa being recruited, especially when you start thinking about some of the diseases themselves splitting. Obviously, breast cancer studies are female-oriented, prostate studies are male-oriented. Some of the diseases like lung cancer just have a higher incidence rate in the male population. So some of those discrepancies are not due necessarily to a lack of reaching out to female patients, but more due to a difference in incidence. But planning ahead on that outreach to the diverse population, especially if it's a disease where that's going to be an important regulatory issue, needs to be done early. Another question was, are QTC prolongation studies as standalone studies required only if the drug has a known cardiology effect, or is it required regardless? So for the small molecule inhibitors, QT program of some type is required. For the antibodies and immuno-oncology studies, it depends on the individual drug product. There is not a specific requirement for that to be a standalone study. You can try to incorporate it into your phase 1 dose escalation study or into your expansion group trials, and we would typically advocate that so that you're not dealing with the QT issue on your late phase 2 studies and your randomized phase 3 studies. Another question was, from a regulatory submission startup perspective, where would you put Asia Pacific, Europe, Latin America, and India in terms of first patient in? So less and less studies are being done in India, particularly for oncology, because of changes in India's rules in terms of patent protections for sponsors, as well as issues that India requires in the informed consent for sponsors to take responsibility for adverse events, whether related to study drug or not. So there are some sponsors still going to India, but it's few and far between, so I'm not going to comment on that. I will comment as well that that adverse event issue, we have had come up with similar language in Brazil, and it's caused some sponsors to choose to stay away from Latin America. With that said, in terms of the startup, in general, the U.S. has the faster startup process because once you filed your IND, in terms of starting up your individual sites, it's the site startup process, whereas for most of the rest of the world, you have to do your clinical trial application for each individual study. Europe does not always lag significantly behind the U.S., and there are some countries that can be a little bit faster at times. Belgium is an easy example of that, but obviously Belgium has a limited population due to size. So that's the general rules on that. The timelines for the developed Asian countries such as Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong are in line typically with the Western European countries as well. A separate question related to the Latin American startup hurdles. Clearly, conditions tend to change from country to country and time to time. Which countries are the most attractive in Latin America? We have always found Chile to be a relatively attractive country for oncology studies. Their treatment regimens tend to match Western Europe very, very well. Their startup timelines are in line with Western Europe. On the other hand, in Brazil, they have a notoriously difficult startup process, and we find that we get a lot of complex questions on the randomized larger studies in Brazil where you would really consider going there. And Argentina also can be difficult, but not as difficult necessarily as Brazil. Peru is also a consideration. But we tend to find Europe more favorable in general than Latin America. Do you feel patient outreach can be effective in a phase 1 dose escalation study or only in later phases?
This is Jennifer, and I actually think that it can be helpful in phase 1 studies. Phase 1 studies are designed so you have basically exhausted all of your standard of care. So if you have a phase 1 drug that is patient-friendly and the protocol is patient-friendly, then yes, patient outreach would absolutely work.
And we've even done phase 1 studies in very limited populations because the drug perhaps was very genetically focused or would only have an indication in a very specific solid tumor or leukemia. And then to get those patients into the phase 1 centers, we found doing the patient outreach type approaches through advocacy groups, websites, the sites themselves was extremely important to meet the trial timelines we had set. Another question was, Jennifer mentioned using social media for patient outreach, and it can be a powerful tool that can also backfire. Can we talk a little bit more about how it could backfire?
If you have a study that is a randomized study, and if it's a blinded study, patients will start guessing at what arm they've been assigned to. And even if it's an open label study and they know what arm they've been assigned to, they'll start contributing every little adverse event to the drug, which may or may not actually be contributable to the drug. So it can drive down the desirability of whichever arm that patient has been assigned to, and you might see a higher dropout rate within that arm.
And the other issue I know that is a concern is the chat rooms and other modes of communication that get set up in websites that go into great detail with patients then talking to each other about what's happening at their site, making guesses about what arm they're on, but also perhaps influencing the way adverse events get reported and collected. I do know that this happens to be an FDA concern, and they're not sure what to do about it at the moment. So it is just something for the community to be aware of. We don't have the magic answer on that one either. So we're aware that the internet, like for everything else, has its pluses and minuses, and it definitely does have a positive role in recruitment, but like everything else, it's not perfect. Another question is competition for relapsed recurrent patients and many indications for phase 1 immuno-oncology studies is high in many areas. Are there geographies or enrollment approaches we recommend to help recruitment? So I'll take that one. We find that is an issue that we deal with, and not just in phase 1, across all phases, and not just in immuno-oncology. So you could end up with a very specific recurrent subpopulation of lung cancer or subpopulation of colorectal cancer that you're going after, or requiring a specific regimen for pancreatic cancer, and you could be in something where there are 20 different trials being run already that you're aware of simply by looking on clinicaltrials.gov. With that said, there are lots of options for how to work around this. If your drug is exciting and new, you can still compete. And it's rare that we recommend to a U.S.-based sponsor not to include the U.S. in their trials, or to a European-based sponsor not to include Europe in their studies. That is what your regulators in your area are going to expect at least some of the patients to come from the local area to be sure that the drug truly works where they're going to be asked to approve it. With that said, though, if your population is that specific and you know you're up against tight competition, then you have to look at where those competitors are running their studies and try to go elsewhere. So if they've got Western Europe blanketed, you can consider pushing further into Eastern Europe. If they have Western and Eastern Europe blanketed, you can consider pushing into Asia. If you're really in something that's highly competitive, then you can consider pushing into the developed world if the standard of care prior treatment matches the requirements for Europe and the U.S. If it turns out all those things are already taken by the competitors, then you know up front that your plan is going to require more sites and more time to accomplish its goals because you're in an extremely competitive area. And you need to think if it's going to complete in a timely manner for you to be able to meet your approval considerations, or does the drug have other options for how you can design the program? What do we recommend for rare disease area patients? Rare diseases you cannot actually recruit a patients you have to wait for. So I'm assuming what they're asking about is, and we're going to answer it this way in terms of a very genetically specified trial that's going to really narrow the population. How do we try to handle this?
Hi, this is Ross. We do have sites where you have a basket trials, basically, where you need a specific genetic mutation. Basically working with the sites up front, making sure they understand the rarity of this patient population, and having a plan internally how they're going to recruit these patients. It's going to be different for every study, but we are able to basically work with the KOL within each country. Those studies will not have multiple sites per country. You may end up having only one or two sites per country, which are the key opinion leaders, referring centers for other centers to refer those rare patients for them to see.
And that's also where we find that if there's an advocacy group around that genetic mutation can be really helpful. Sometimes even putting one together can be part of the program, and really utilizing the web as well to funnel those patients in that get recognized in the community and then sent in.
Sorry, Ross. I'll jump in and just say it also is helpful to have a separate informed consent specifically for that genetic testing that's separate from the study consent. So all patients that could potentially qualify are going to be pre-identified.
Yeah. And if there's a high screen failure, even definitely more reason you need to have like a pre-screening ICF, so for patients to know actually if they're going to be eligible for the study.
And that gets to another question that we had where it was, how do you propose conducting proactive genetic testing? This can be very expensive for patients. So if the trial requires next-generation sequencing, you're correct, it is expensive for patients. And if it's going to require something where the genetic finding might be present in 1 out of 50 patients, and just to use a round number, the next-generation sequencing is somewhere between $2,000 and $8,000, that's often too expensive for the sponsor to cover as well. So you need to be working with sites where a large number of patients are already getting that testing, or work through the internet to get patients that were tested referred in. It is a huge challenge. It's one we deal with on trials. It is a doable solution, but I can't tell you that it's an easy solution. And the expense of the testing is a real issue. If the issue you're dealing with instead is an immunohistochemistry test or a specific FISH that can be performed where the individual testing is less expensive, then having the patients be able to either sign the full study consent and get that testing done, or sign a consent for pre-testing is the way to go so that you can be screening as many patients as possible and finding those patients with the marker and have them lined up that way. Another question was, when sites are working on a competing study, what do we do to steer them to our study versus the other study?
Well, we can't really completely steer them, but I think one of the best ways that we can do is really be attentive to them and their questions that they ask, and make sure that our study is always at the forefront of their brain. And again, that's just with the engagement through daily communications, either weekly emails, weekly telephone calls, and also having really well-trained CRAs that are able to help answer their questions as soon as they come up. So if they have a potential patient identified, they can easily and quickly determine if they're a better candidate for this study or for that study.
And the other issue tied in with that as well is when we do the initial early presentations with the site, to really make sure that we're not just speaking to the PI. The recruitment team at the site, PI is extraordinarily important. That MD interaction is going to be very important, but the nursing interaction, the coordinator interaction, we want to make sure the team's educated about why that study is exciting. If the coordinator walks into the room excited about the study, the patient feels that. One of the other questions was referral networks are key in some difficult studies for recruitment, but sometimes the oncologists are reluctant to give their patients for a clinical trial to another oncologist. This is a real issue. This is not a subtle issue at all. It gets, especially for the U.S., where it gets to economic reimbursement, and if the doctor at the community practice, for example, doesn't have the trial open, but the big oncology center 10 miles away does, and he sends the patient over for the trial, instead of doing something he can do in his office, he's now losing money from his pocket. And you can't pay him because sick cancer patients are considered an at-risk population in the U.S. So it really comes down to relationships and helping to foster the doctor that's getting referred to's relationship with his referral base. And you have to hope that that person that's getting the patient in offers the patient back if they went on study and failed at some point. Would you like to continue treating the patient, or should we see them for the rest of their time? Holding on to them afterwards, if they wanted them back, does not build the relationship and foster further referrals. We do help make referral letters if sites need that, but I think the best thing is when the physician at the referral center is doing the outreach themselves, along with their study nurse and coordinator, and remembers to keep communicating back to the referring doctor how the patient's doing. Because if that patient went on study and got a response, any doctor feels good about that. And that helps keep that relationship between the central doctor and the referring doctor.
And I would add, oncology would allow satellite centers to also open and see those patients, which allow the increases the catchment area and participation in multiple studies from the satellite centers.
I agree. Another question was, what do we think of core biopsy versus fine needle aspiration? And the question was asked for lung cancer, but I think we can answer it in general. When we need to submit tumor tissue, is biopsy often a limiting factor? So anytime a trial has required biopsies, that in and of itself is a limiting factor. And I'll take it even further. Anytime a trial has any extra step, that's a limiting factor. Be it collecting PK, collecting PBMCs, collecting multiple pharmacodynamic testing, requiring the patient to come in for more visits than might otherwise be needed to just simply administer the study drug. So when you're designing protocols, particularly not your phase 1 study, because your phase 1 study is your time to get these extra things done. But when you're in your later phase of development, each time you're putting something in the protocol, you have to ask yourself, okay, if this might have even a minor negative impact on recruitment, is it important enough? And sometimes it is important enough. If we need the tissue to know if the patient's eligible and will benefit, then you need to put it in. But if it's more that it's a nice to know, you have to ask yourself, is it important enough? An FNA is always going to be, or a brushing, is always going to be less invasive than a true biopsy. So therefore, whenever an FNA or a brushing provides sufficient context for you to make key decisions to advance your program, and you don't require a core biopsy, you go with the FNA or the brushing. And you can extend that analogy to so many different things that get written into a protocol. An example that comes up all the time with PK, and this I would take to phase 1 studies. If your early data doesn't suggest that your drug is going to be around beyond 8 hours, then don't do PK beyond 8 hours. Because once you're doing a 12-hour or 24-hour PK, 12 hours, patients got to start the study drug. Something had to have happened first. They have to have staff there at nighttime to draw that PK. That's obviously going to be a recruitment hurdle. You need a 24-hour PK, you're making the patient come in the next day maybe unnecessarily. That's a recruitment hurdle. Things that aren't big recruitment hurdles are quality of life questionnaires. If they're done, timed along with when patients are coming in already for visits. To be very honest, when I was an investigator, I used to use the quality of life questionnaires. If a patient had to sit in the patient room before I got in there, it was a great way to keep them busy and occupied. So people worry, oh, is it too many questionnaires? No, these patients are going to have to go get an x-ray done or get an ECG done. While they're waiting, it's perfectly fine for them to complete them. So those actually aren't a hurdle. So not everything that you add into a study is necessarily bad, but everything that's at least slightly invasive is. Ophthalmologic testing is always a hurdle. Dermatologic evaluations are always a hurdle. They're hard to schedule. They're hard on the site staffs to get scheduled. They're hard for the patients to travel for. Those are things to just really think about. Jennifer, take this one. Any particular thoughts about recruiting for pediatric trials?
Recruitment for pediatric studies, again, that's going to be education of your PI, and then also those PIs being able to have the conversation then with the families. I find that pediatric oncology studies are one of the sadder studies to have to recruit for, but it's also extremely rewarding. Depending on what stage you're studying, you're going to have patients waiting to come into the study, again, depending on what that inclusion-exclusion is. But these are parents out here that are desperate. They're looking for something for their child, and so they are out there seeking every study and every possibility out there. So again, if you do have a pediatric study and you are in a dose escalation prior to an expansion, really having clear set wait list and kind of a first come, first serve. Make sure you set up that process on how you're going to move through that wait list to get those patients then assigned into a slot on that study.
And the things I would add for the other flip side of it, because Jen talked about the early phase, more often we'll be dealing with the late phase where you're trying to meet the pediatric requirements for the regulators. And the good thing actually about pediatric studies is the larger, high-quality pediatric cancer centers are fully set up for this and have excellent networks for getting the pediatric patients recruited into them and for really having nice, smooth systems to treat the patients and their families incredibly appropriately. Despite that, if you've done the adult program and now it's to try to get the approval in the pediatric indication as well to meet the regulatory requirements, you're typically dealing with a cancer that affects a very tiny number of people under age of 18. So it's a very limited population. You might need to open key geographic sites and again use the web and facilitate patient travel. But these sites are actually typically expert at that as well because they've developed systems for that, not just for industry, but for the COG studies as well, and tapping into that expertise can really facilitate the pediatric trials also. With that, we do really thank you for the questions and your participation and hope this was helpful for you.
Thank you all, and thank you for attending this Fierce Live webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank our speakers for participating and Medpace for presenting today's webinar. This webinar has been recorded. You will be able to access the recording within 24 hours on the same page you used to register for this event. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.